The world was water, a vast, placid and silent sea of brown, life-giving water that had swallowed the land whole. This was the season of Akhet, the inundation. For 3 months of every year the great god Hapi, the spirit of the Nile, would swell his river, pushing it over its banks to lay a fresh, thick blanket of fertile black silt upon the fields of Egypt. This was not a disaster, it was a resurrection. From the slightly elevated ground of his village, a cluster of simple mud brick houses, the farmer Kenamon watched the floodwaters. His fields, the ones he had so painstakingly harvested just a moon ago, were gone, submerged beneath the placid brown expanse. He felt not a sense of loss, but one of profound sacred patience. The gods were renewing his world. During Akhet, the farmer's primary work was done. There was no ploughing, no sowing, no reaping. It was a time of waiting. Kenamon was a man in his prime, his body a testament to a life of labor. His skin was the color of baked earth, his hands were calloused and strong, and his back was permanently stooped from a lifetime of bending to the soil. He stood beside his son Back, a boy of 10 summers with wide, curious eyes. "See, my son," Kenamon said, his voice a low rumble. "Hapi has come to bless us. He brings the black land back to life." He pointed to the line where the desert began, the Deshret, or Red Land. It was a stark, unforgiving border. On one side was the life-giving flood, on the other the immense sun-bleached desert, a realm of death and chaos. Their entire existence was lived on this thin, fertile ribbon between two powerful and opposing forces. During the inundation, Kenamon's life turned inward. He mended his tools, his wooden plow and sickles, preparing them for the hard work to come. He replastered the walls of his simple one-room house with fresh mud mixed with straw. He visited with his neighbors, sharing stories, beer and the quiet camaraderie of men whose fates were bound together by the same divine rhythm. It was a time for community, a time to reaffirm the bonds that held their small world together. But for many farmers, Akhet was also a time of state labor. The Pharaoh, the living god, had a claim on their idle hands. While their fields were underwater, thousands of men like Kenamon would be conscripted for the great building projects, quarrying stone, digging canals or raising the magnificent temples and tombs that honored the gods and guaranteed the eternal life of the king. Miles to the south, on the high, arid plateau of Giza, this state labor was reaching its zenith. Here the flood was not a time of rest, but the busiest and most crucial period of the year. This was the world of Passa, the stonemason. Passa was a man of a different build than Kenamon. His hands were also calloused, but they were the hands of a craftsman, skilled in the precise and patient language of stone. His shoulders and back were immensely powerful from a life of lifting and shaping heavy blocks. He lived in a state-built workers' village at the foot of the plateau, a grid of simple, functional houses that was a world away from Kenamon's rural village. For Passa, the inundation meant one thing: the arrival of the great stones. The floodwaters turned the Nile Valley into a massive highway. Huge barges, laden with colossal blocks of fine white limestone from the quarries at Tura, and massive granite beams from as far as Aswan, could now be floated almost to the base of the Great Pyramid itself. Passa stood on the bustling harbor quay, the air thick with the shouts of overseers, the rhythmic chanting of labor gangs, and the groan of ropes. He watched as a new barge, carrying a single immense block of granite destined for the king's burial chamber, was carefully maneuvered towards the shore. The scale of the operation was staggering. Hundreds of men, their brown bodies gleaming with sweat under the bright hot sun, strained together, pulling on thick papyrus ropes to guide the massive stone onto a wooden sledge. This was Passa's world. It was a world of pure, focused, monumental effort. His own task was one of precision. He was a finisher, one of the skilled artisans who would shape the fine white casing stones that would form the pyramid's smooth, gleaming outer shell. He spent his days in a vast, open-air workshop, the ground perpetually covered in a thick layer of fine white limestone dust. This dust was the snow of his world. It coated his skin, his hair and his simple linen kilt. It filled the air, creating a constant, hazy quality to the bright sunlight, and when the wind blew, the entire Giza plateau seemed to be caught in a blizzard of white. He worked with a quiet, intense concentration, his copper chisel and wooden mallet his only tools. He was not just shaping stone, he was participating in a sacred act. He was helping to build the Mer, the place of ascension, the eternal vessel for his God-King. He believed with an unshakable faith that his work was essential to maintaining Martyrt, the divine concept of order, truth and cosmic balance. If the Pharaoh's journey to the afterlife was successful, the gods would be pleased, the Nile would continue to flood, the sun would continue to rise, and the world would remain in its proper order. The farmer's harvest depended on the stonemason's chisel. As the day ended, Passa returned to the workers' village. He shared his ration of coarse bread, onions and beer with his fellow masons. They were not slaves, they were a skilled and respected workforce, and their lives, though hard, were filled with a profound sense of purpose. They were the builders of eternity. Back in his village, Kenamon also ended his day. He sat with his family outside their home, watching the stars appear in the vast clear desert sky. He looked south, towards the capital, and saw the faint man-made mountain of the Great Pyramid on the horizon. He knew that men were toiling there even now to serve the God-King. He did not resent their work, he felt a part of it. He, the farmer, provided the bread that fed the builders. They, the builders, created the tomb that ensured the king's journey to the gods, and the gods in turn commanded the river that gave him life. It was a great, unbreakable cycle. As the flood waters lapped quietly at the edge of his village, Kenamon felt a deep sense of peace. All was as it should be. The season of waiting had begun. The Giza Plateau was a world apart, an immense man-made mountain range rising from the edge of the desert. For Passa the stonemason, and the tens of thousands of men who worked alongside him, this was the entire universe. It was a place of organized, relentless and sacred labor, a testament to the power of a single unifying idea, the divinity of the Pharaoh. A day in the life of Passa was a study in disciplined rhythm. It began before dawn, with the braying of donkeys and the shouts of the foremen moving through the narrow streets of the workers' village, Setmat, the place of truth. The air was already thick with the smell of baking bread from the communal ovens, the staple of their diet. Passa would rise from his simple sleeping mat, his muscles already aching in anticipation of the day's labor. He would eat his breakfast, a round, dense loaf of barley bread, and a cup of thick, nutritious beer, and join the great river of men flowing out of the village, and up the causeway to the plateau. The pyramid itself, still incomplete, was a breathtaking sight in the dawn's first light. It was a beehive of human activity. Vast ramps, built of mud brick and timber, snaked up its sides. On these ramps, teams of laborers, their bodies straining in perfect unison, hauled the massive multi-ton blocks of stone on wooden sledges. The path of the sledge was lubricated with water to reduce friction, a simple but ingenious technique. The air echoed with their rhythmic chants, a chorus of shared effort that was the true engine of construction. Haul, haul, haul. The sound was a constant percussive heartbeat that drove the entire operation. Parser's work was higher up, on the tiers of the pyramid that had already been laid. His was not the brute force of the haulers, but the precise skill of the artisan. He was part of a team responsible for shaping and fitting the fine white Tura limestone casing stones. These were the stones that would give the pyramid its final smooth gleaming appearance, making it shine like a jewel in the desert sun. He found his designated block, a massive roughly shaped piece of limestone. His foreman, a stern man with a reed staff and a keen eye for imperfection, marked the exact lines for cutting with red ochre paint. Parser's job was to make that rough block into a perfectly angled, geometrically precise work of art. He began his work, a process of patient, methodical violence. He used his copper chisel and a heavy wooden mallet, striking the stone with a practiced rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. A small chip of limestone would fly off. Tap, tap. Another. For hours, this would be his entire world. The feel of the mallet in his hand, the sharp ring of metal on stone, and the fine white dust that flew up to coat his face and fill his lungs. This was the snow of Giza, a constant man-made blizzard that turned the world into a hazy monochromatic landscape of white and brown. The bright, warm sunlight struggled to cut through this dusty haze, creating an ethereal, almost dreamlike quality to the scene. The work was dangerous. A misplaced blow could shatter a stone that had taken weeks to quarry and transport. A moment of carelessness could result in a crushed hand or worse. Medical care was available, doctors who could set and stitch wounds, but the best medicine was vigilance. At midday, a horn would sound, signaling a break for the midday meal. The chanting of the haulers would cease. The tapping of the chisels would fall silent. The men would gather in the shade of the half-finished walls, their bodies slick with sweat and caked with the white dust. They would receive their rations, more bread, a handful of garlic or onions for flavor and health, and more beer. The beer was thick and nutritious, a vital source of calories and hydration, and safer to drink than the river water. During this break, there was a sense of camaraderie. The men were from all corners of Egypt, brought together by the will of the Pharaoh. They shared stories of their villages, gambled with small stones, and complained about the foreman. They were not slaves, but a proud corps of skilled laborers, conscripted for a season to serve their god-king. Their service was a form of taxation, a duty, but it was also a source of immense pride. They were building a stairway to the stars, a machine for resurrection that would ensure the prosperity of the entire land. Parser sat with his team, his hands raw, his body aching. He looked up at the immense structure they were creating. It was more than a tomb, it was a symbol of their entire worldview. It was a physical manifestation of Ma'at, of the perfect eternal order of the cosmos. Each stone, perfectly fitted, represented a part of that order. His work, his sweat, his aching muscles, they were all a small but essential contribution to the eternity of Egypt itself. As the horn sounded again, signaling the end of the break, Passer picked up his chisel and mallet. He felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was not just a stonemason, he was a guardian of cosmic balance, an artisan in the service of a god. He returned to his block, the sun beating down, the white dust swirling around him. The rhythmic tapping began again, the steady, patient heartbeat of a civilization building its own immortality. As the invisible gears of the cosmos turned, the waters of the Nile began their slow, deliberate retreat. The season of Peret, the emergence, had begun. For Kenamon the farmer, the time of waiting was over. The time of the most intense, back-breaking labor of the year had arrived. He stood at the edge of his field, his heart filled with a familiar mixture of hope and anxiety. The flood had been a good one, not too high, and not too low. As the water receded, it had left behind a thick, rich and perfectly flat layer of black silt. This was the Kemet, the Black Land, the source of all of Egypt's wealth and life. The silt was still wet, dark and heavy with nutrients. It was perfect. The work began immediately. There was no time to waste before the relentless sun baked the new soil into a hard, cracked shell. Kenamon yoked his 2 oxen to his simple wooden plow, a tool that had not changed in 1,000 years. His son Buck walked ahead of the oxen, encouraging them with a stick and a soft crooning song. Kenamon leaned his full weight onto the plow's handle, the wooden share biting into the thick, heavy mud. It was a grueling primal struggle, man and beast against the earth. They moved in slow, straight lines back and forth across the field, turning over the rich silt, preparing it for the seed. The black mud clung to his feet and legs, a cool, heavy embrace. After the plowing came the sowing. Kenamon walked the newly plowed furrows, a leather bag of precious barley seed at his side. He cast the seed with a practiced rhythmic flick of his wrist, a gesture repeated by his father and his father's father. He was not just throwing grain, he was entrusting his family's survival to the soil and the gods. Once the seed was sown, his wife Iset and the other village women would drive a flock of sheep across the field, their small hooves gently treading the seeds into the protective embrace of the earth. The weeks that followed were a testament to the farmer's eternal vigilance. The primary task was irrigation. While the silt was rich, the sun was a merciless enemy. Kenamon had to keep his fields watered. He used a shaduf, a simple but ingenious counterweighted lever that allowed him to lift water from the irrigation canal and pour it into the smaller channels that crisscrossed his fields. It was repetitive, monotonous work, a constant cycle of lowering the bucket, lifting the water, and swinging the long pole. His back screamed in protest, but he continued, his movements becoming a mechanical, almost trance-like rhythm. Meanwhile, on the high plateau of Giza, the work of the pyramid builders continued, its pace unbroken by the changing seasons of the valley below. For Passer the stonemason, the world remained one of stone and dust. The recession of the flood waters meant that the great barges from the southern quarries could no longer reach the plateau's edge. The focus of the work shifted. The vast teams of conscripted farmers would soon return to their fields, and the permanent workforce of skilled artisans like Passer would concentrate on the more detailed, intricate work. Passer was now working on a section of the grand causeway that would link the valley temple to the pyramid itself. His task was to carve a section of a massive continuous relief that would depict the pharaoh's triumphs and his divine connection to the gods. This was a different kind of work from shaping the casing stones. It required not just precision, but artistry. He worked from a master drawing sketched onto the stone wall in black ink by a high-ranking scribe artist. The scene was one of cosmic order, the pharaoh making an offering to the hawk-headed god Horus. Passa's job was to give this flat drawing life, to turn it into a three-dimensional reality. He used his finest, sharpest copper chisels, his touch now delicate and sure. He was not just a mason, he was a sculptor. The bright sunlight reflecting off the white limestone was blinding. The air was still thick with the snow of stone dust, but Passa was lost in his work. He felt a deep artistic satisfaction as the powerful form of the god began to emerge from the stone under his hands. He was carving a story that would last for eternity, a message to the gods and to all future generations. He was etching the principles of Ma'at into the very fabric of the world. Back in the valley, Kenamon watched as the first tender green shoots of barley began to push their way up through the black soil. It was a moment of quiet, profound joy. It was the promise of life, a sign that the gods had accepted their labor, but he knew the work was far from over. He now had to protect his crop from birds, from pests, and from the ever-present threat of a stray hippopotamus wandering up from the river. His vigil would not end until the stalks were heavy with grain, ready for the harvest. The farmer and the craftsman, one cultivating life from the mud, the other carving eternity from the stone, were two sides of the same Egyptian coin, both toiling under the watchful eye of the sun god. Life in ancient Egypt was a river, and like the Nile itself, it had many currents, eddies, and depths. While the grand seasonal tasks of farming and pyramid building defined the year, the daily flow of life was shaped by smaller, more intimate currents: the family, the village, the local market, and the ever-present gods. For Kenamon's family, the village was their entire world. It was a tight, interwoven community of a few dozen families, all related by blood or marriage. Their small mud brick houses were clustered together for security and companionship. Life was lived publicly. The sounds and smells of one's neighbors were a constant presence. Iset, Kenamon's wife, spent much of her day in the company of the other village women. Their work was a communal affair. They would gather at the village well to draw water and exchange gossip. They would sit together in a shady spot, grinding barley into flour on stone querns, their rhythmic work accompanied by songs and stories. Iset was the heart of Kenamon's household. She managed the food stores, baked the daily bread in their small conical clay oven, brewed the essential nutritious beer, and wove the linen cloth that clothed her family. She was also the primary caregiver for their son, Bak. Her role was not seen as subservient, but as essential and complementary to Kenamon's. Theirs was a partnership, a small economic unit dedicated to survival. Once a week, they would travel to the local market. It was not the grand international bazaar of a great city, but a smaller, more intimate affair where local villages traded their surplus goods. Kenamon might trade a few chickens for a new clay pot, or Iset might trade a piece of her finely woven linen for a handful of salt from a desert trader. It was a vital break in the routine, a chance to see new faces and hear news from the wider world. The spiritual life of the village was centered not on the great state temples, but on the worship of local gods and household deities. Every home had a small niche for figures of Bees, the fierce but benevolent dwarf god who protected the family, and Tauret, the hippopotamus goddess who watched over childbirth. They made small offerings of food and flowers, their piety a direct and personal conversation with the spirits who governed their immediate world. For Parsa, life in the workers' village at Giza was a different kind of community. Set Ma'at was a state-planned town, a remarkable feat of urban organization. The houses were uniform, laid out in a perfect grid, a reflection of the order and precision of the project they served. This was not a community of families, but a community of work. The men were divided into gangs, or phylae, often named after parts of a ship, like starboard and port, which were further divided into smaller crews. This created a strong sense of identity and rivalry. Parsa's crew prided themselves on their skill and speed. They had a friendly but intense competition with the other teams of masons. This rivalry was encouraged by the overseers. It was a way to boost productivity. After the day's work, the village was a place of simple, rough camaraderie. The men would gather to drink their beer rations, to play board games like Senet, or to listen to storytellers. They were a closed community, living and working together, separated from the rest of Egyptian society. They had their own doctors, their own scribes, and even their own court, to settle disputes. Parsa, like the other men, was free to leave the village on his days off. He might travel to the markets of Memphis to buy a small luxury, or visit a local shrine, but his life was fundamentally tied to the pyramid. The state provided his food, his housing, and his tools. In return, it demanded his skill, his strength, and his unwavering dedication. The two worlds, that of the farmer and that of the craftsman, were deeply interconnected, yet profoundly different. Kenamon's life was cyclical, governed by the natural rhythms of the sun and the river. His community was one of blood and soil. Parsa's life was linear, governed by the foreman's call and the architect's plan. His community was one of shared labor and a common, monumental goal. Both men were cogs in the great machine of the Egyptian state. Their lives a testament to the civilization's unique ability to organize both the natural world of the Nile Valley and the human world of a mass labor force towards a single, eternal purpose. The air in the Nile Valley grew thick and heavy. The brilliant green of the barley fields slowly transformed into a vast shimmering sea of gold under the relentless Egyptian sun. The season of Shimu, the harvest, had arrived. This was the most frantic and crucial period of the farmer's year, a desperate race against time to bring in the crop that would determine whether the coming year would be one of feast or famine. For Kenamon, his wife Iset, and his son Bark, the days became a blur of exhausting communal labor. They rose before the sun had even touched the horizon, their breakfast a hasty mouthful of bread as they walked to the fields. The entire village mobilized. This was not a task for a single family, but for the whole community working as one. Kenamon, along with the other men, moved in a long, disciplined line through the barley field. They were armed with simple sickles, their wooden handles curved and smooth, their blades made of hundreds of tiny razor-sharp flint shards set into a groove. They worked with a rhythmic swinging motion, cutting through the dry, brittle stalks. The sound of the sickles whispering through the grain was the sound of life itself. Behind them, the women and older children, including Iset and Bark, followed, gathering the cut barley into bundles or sheaves. The work was grueling. The sun was a merciless hammer. The dry stalks and chaff filled the air, an itchy, irritating dust that coated their skin and clogged their throats. Their muscles screamed in protest, but they did not stop. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their movements fueled by a sense of shared, urgent purpose. After the barley was cut and bundled, it was transported to the village threshing floor, a large, circular, hard-packed area of earth. Here the grain was separated from the stalk. The sheaves were spread out, and a team of oxen, their hooves heavy and broad, were driven round and round in a circle, their weight breaking the grain heads. Then came the winnowing. The women, I sat among them, would use large wooden scoops to toss the threshed grain into the air. The afternoon breeze, a welcome gift from the gods, would carry away the lighter chaff, while the heavier precious kernels of barley would fall back to the floor. It was a dusty, tiring job, but it was also a moment of truth, the first time they could truly see the fruits of their year-long labor. But a shadow loomed over the harvest, the shadow of the scribe. Once the grain was winnowed and collected, the state would claim its share. Kenamon watched nervously as the village elder negotiated with the temple scribe, a man whose authority was absolute. The scribe, with his papyrus scroll and palette of inks, was the agent of the Pharaoh's power. He would measure the total harvest and calculate the temple's and the palace's portion, a tax that could amount to more than half of the total crop. A harsh assessment could be ruinous. It was a tense moment, a reminder that while the farmers did the work, the ultimate power lay with the state they served. On the Giza Plateau, the changing of the seasons had a different, but no less profound meaning. The Great Pyramid was nearing its completion. After decades of labor, the final glorious stage was at hand. Parsa the stonemason was now part of an elite team working on the pyramidion, the capstone that would sit at the very apex of the great structure. This was no ordinary stone. It was a perfectly shaped, pyramid-shaped block of fine granite, which would be covered in electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver. It would be the glittering jewel atop the Pharaoh's stairway to the heavens, the first thing to catch the morning sun, and the last to hold its light at dusk. Parsa worked with a reverence that bordered on worship. His tools were the finest, his focus absolute. He was no longer just a craftsman, he was a high priest of his art, preparing the most sacred object of the entire monument. The snowy white dust of the limestone workshops was far below. Here at the summit of the plateau, the air was clear, the sunlight brilliant, and the sense of impending culmination was a palpable energy that ran through the entire workforce. He looked down from his high workshop and could see the vast golden fields of the Nile Valley below, where men like Kenamon were gathering their harvest. He saw the two great acts that defined his civilization, the gathering of the grain that sustained the body, and the raising of the stone that sustained the soul of the nation. He, Parsa, had played his part in the latter. His name would never be known, his individual work would be anonymous. But the great monument itself, this man-made mountain of eternal order, would be his legacy. He felt a profound sense of peace and completion. His work, like Kenamon's, was almost done. The great cycle had turned, the harvest was in, the state's share had been taken, and Kenamon's own granary, a small mud-sealed annex to his house, was full enough to see his family through the year. The season of waiting of Aket was approaching once more. Kenamon stood with his son back, looking at the first, faint signs of the Nile's rising waters. He had fulfilled his duty. He had worked in harmony with the gods and the seasons. He had provided for his family and for his king. His heart, he felt, was light. In the ancient Egyptian worldview, the ultimate judgment of a person's life was the weighing of the heart. After death, the soul would be led before the god Osiris, and one's heart would be weighed on a great scale against the feather of Ma'at, the symbol of truth, order, and justice. If the heart was heavy with sin, with greed, with laziness, with dishonesty, it would outweigh the feather, and the soul would be devoured by a terrible monster. But if the heart was as light as the feather, the soul would be granted eternal life in the paradise of the field of reeds. For a common man like Kenamon, a good life was one lived in accordance with Ma'at. It was a life of hard work, of devotion to one's family, of respect for the gods, and of loyal service to the pharaoh. As he looked at his full granary and his healthy son, Kenamon felt the deep, quiet satisfaction of a man who had lived such a life. He had played his part in maintaining the cosmic order. Miles away, on the Giza plateau, a great ceremony was taking place. The moment of culmination had arrived. The Great Pyramid, a labor of generations, was finally complete. Parsa the stonemason stood with thousands of his fellow workers. A vast crowd gathered at the base of the colossal structure. They watched as the gleaming electrum-covered pyramidion was slowly, painstakingly, miraculously raised up the side of the pyramid, pulled by hundreds of men chanting in unison. It was a moment of supreme collective triumph. As the capstone was finally lowered into place at the very apex of the pyramid, a great roaring cheer erupted from the assembled crowd, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the desert. The sun, catching the golden tip, made the entire monument blaze with a divine, unbearable light. The stairway to the heavens was complete. The Pharaoh's vessel for eternity was ready. Parsa looked up at the perfect gleaming pyramid, its smooth white sides a testament to his skill, its golden tip a beacon of his faith. He felt a sense of awe so profound it bordered on a religious experience. He had not just built a tomb, he had helped to secure the eternal life of his God-King, and in doing so, he had helped to guarantee the eternal stability of his world. His name would be forgotten, his individual chisel marks invisible, but his work would stand for millions of days, a silent, powerful testament to his devotion. He too had played his part in maintaining Ma'at. The farmer and the craftsman, two ordinary men living in an extraordinary time. Their lives on the surface were so different, one governed by the black mud of the river, the other by the white dust of the plateau, but they were united by a shared purpose, a common faith in a system that gave their lives meaning. Kenamon's grain fed Parsa's body. Parsa's stone monument housed the spirit of the king, who guaranteed Kenamon's harvest. They were the foundation upon which the entire glittering edifice of pharaonic civilization was built. Their quiet, rhythmic and powerful lives were the true heartbeat of ancient Egypt. Their legacy is not written in the grand hieroglyphs of the kings, but in the enduring strength of the monuments they built, and in the timeless cyclical wisdom of the land they served. They were the keepers of the black land, the builders of eternity, the humble servants of the sun's anvil, and their work, like the great river itself, would endure.